Shalom Aleichem. I'm Rachel Schechter, editor of the Forvets. Welcome to our food event, Jewish Deli and Yiddish Cooking in a TikTok World. This event was actually inspired by a Zoom discussion we hosted last summer on the question, what did our great-grandparents eat for breakfast? Which drew in over 1,000 viewers. Seeing how much interest there was in old world Ashkenazi cooking, we decided to host another event with this slightly different angle. So let's watch a sample TikTok of a young woman making Lokschenkugel, that's noodle pudding. I can't tell if her accent is Australian or South African or British, but it doesn't matter. She's obviously grown up eating old Eastern European Jewish favorites. Here it is. That in our talk today, we're using the word TikTok as a stand-in for all sorts of social media, including Instagram and Facebook, but also as a metaphor for the fact that so many young Jews today are embracing these traditional recipes of their great-grandparents. And I'm talking about all sorts of Jews, both religious and non-religious, from cities all over the world, and many non-Jews as well who are interested in Jewish cooking. So let's meet our panelists. I hope we can see you all. Jacqueline, can you get us to open up?
We're here, Rachel. We're here.
Okay, good. So I didn't hear anything, so I got nervous. All right, so I want you to meet our panelists. I want to start with Joe Bauer. He's a writer and filmmaker in Berlin whose work often focuses on Jewish foodways. He's also the host of the Yiddish Land podcast that explores the evolution of Jewish cuisine. When he's not at his desk, you can find him running around literally. So that's Joe. Now, Jeffrey Yaskowitz is a food entrepreneur, a chef and thought leader on Jewish food and culture. He co-founded the Gefilteria, which reimagines Yiddish cooking, and co-authored the award-winning cookbook, The Gefilte Manifesto, New Recipes for Old World Jewish Foods. His writings on Jewish food, culture, and history have appeared in The Forward, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and other publications. Shanna Sarna is editor-at-large of The Nasher, an editor for food projects and special content for 70 Faces Media. She's also author of Modern Jewish Baker and Modern Jewish Comfort Food. She relishes the chance to cook a whole tongue and was featured in Glamour magazine rendering schmaltz while nursing her daughter. Jerry Umansky is the chef and owner of Larder Delicatessen and Bakery, a Jewish delicatessen in Cleveland, Ohio. Both Larder and Chef Umansky have been nominated for numerous James Beard Awards, and they continue to explore and serve Jewish food from the whole of the diaspora. So Joe, let me start with you, since you were a panelist at our previous Food Zoom event. And actually, you were the one to suggest that we do a sequel. But first, hopefully we can hear the video and sound. If we could watch an Instagram clip of you making pretzel, that's the old world flatbread with onions and poppy seeds. Jacqueline, do you think we can get it now? No, we don't have the sound.
If you just click the little button in the right hand corner of the screen, you might be able to hear it. I can see that the sound button is not clicked. Yeah.
I never heard of a pretzel until visiting Florence Kahn's bakery in the Marais neighborhood of Paris, the historic Jewish quarter of the city. But I had heard of Florence Kahn, having spotted her cookbook, Yiddish Cuisine, at my Berlin bagel spot, Fine Bagels. I knew I wanted to visit, but I didn't have a clue of what I'd order. Shuffling inside, I panic ordered the first thing I saw in front of me with my broken French. Fortunately, what I saw was a sign promoting their pretzel sandwich. As it turned out, this was like finding high-shelf whiskey at an open bar. I got to meet Kahn later on and learn more about her story, which I wrote about back in April for Food 52, along with a recipe I made up for a pretzel sabich inspired by my visit. More recently, I went back to the beginning and made the OG pretzel, as it were, which which is what I'm working on here. The simple flatbread of our shtetl ancestors smothered in onions and poppy seeds. Nothing more, nothing less. I used my challah recipe for the dough with white whole wheat flour for what I think is a richer flavor. You can find the recipe for this pretzel at aish.com and make it yourself, because unless you're in Berlin, I can't really do it for you.
That's great. I'm glad we finally got the sound working. So Joe, I wanted to ask you, do you think that social media has really made a difference in turning young people on to Ashkenazi cooking?
Yeah, I mean, it clearly has for me. To a little context on myself, I didn't grow up making Jewish food. My grandmother made stuff, but I wasn't really involved in like the kitchen or doing anything. I just, ate the matzo ball soup whenever it came out, or the kugel. And it really wasn't until I was an adult that I started getting more interested in it. So social media was just an easy pathway into exploring what everybody else was doing. So, making the recipes that were familiar to what my grandmother made, but then discovering things that we weren't making in my family, or even connecting with people who were making variations of dishes that I had eaten growing up or that I had yet to discover. But then also finding out that, people were already, and there's a lot of this on the Nasher, people already taking, if they have a mixed cultural background, taking bits and pieces from their background and kind of splicing that together. One of my favorite people to follow is Jamie from Chopsticks Meets Fork, and she combines her Taiwanese heritage with her husband's Jewish heritage. So I think it's absolutely been, a great avenue to explore different Jewish dishes in the entire world.
Right. So is there something that you'd like to see more of in social media?
The only thing, if I were being nitpicky, is so I think there's like a little bit of a chasm between, when TikTok first came out, that was probably the first thing at my age that I got a little grumpy about, like this newfangled thing. But I've since, gotten over that. It's Instagram Reels, all this stuff is just another avenue to express yourself. And for Jewish food, I think it's been great for that. But I still think there's a little bit of a chasm between all the creativity we're seeing in social media and maybe a better historical understanding of where these things come from. And that's something that I'm really interested in. I tried very briefly to do some kind of a recurring series on recipes from Vani Olawando's Vilna Vegetarian. And I would like to see, I would love it.
I don't know if you know that that's written by Eve Jachnowitz.
Yes,
Eve,
absolutely.
yes, so just so people know, she is a Yiddish food scholar. She got her PhD at NYU for Yiddish cooking, and she's a great gourmet chef. So she and I have a cooking show in Yiddish with English subtitles called Eskes Hate, and you'll be able to find the link to that soon in the chat box. So back to you, Joe.
No, it's great for practicing your Yiddish too. But yeah, I would love to see if folks would, especially people who are much better at it than I am, that are able to make all the fancy transitions and keep it quick and engaging, but connecting that to where a lot of these dishes come from. Because another thing I've written about is I didn't coin this term, but the babka effect. A lot of these dishes that were in Europe, but then because of the Holocaust, were not as prevalent, are coming back in popularity because of social media. Rogalach, babka, non-Jews are seeing these things in social media and they're bringing it to their bakeries. But you'll get people who go to like the fine bagels that I mentioned in Berlin, and they don't know the Jewish history of bagels. So a lot of people still think that these things were kind of born out of a vacuum or just a fad on social media. So I think there's an opportunity for Instagram food influencers, TikTok food influencers to, sprinkle a little bit of education, a little bit of history when they're doing, all the nice fancy transitions.
Which you actually do. I mean, you always put it in context whenever you so
I attempt to, yes.
attempt to. Great,
If
thank you.
If I can share about the history
Sure.
piece, Joe, which I totally agree with and feel so passionately about, we've seen consistently on the Nosher that in addition to recipes, that it's some of the content that our audience is most interested in. They want to know where these foods come from. I used to work for a wonderful man of blessed memory named Edgar Bronfman. And he used to say that you cannot have pride in your Jewish identity if you don't know, right? If you don't have education. And I'm paraphrasing, he would say it much more eloquently. And I think that is a core issue, right, in the TikTok world of food, is that how can you feel pride for these Jewish foods, or how can you explain why they're Jewish if you don't even know the history? So that's been an ongoing goal for us, is to really be able to explain some of that, and I think it's so important. And now we need somebody to do those fancy transitions.
No, I think it's also important because what people are relying on is the nostalgia for Bubby and what Bubby used to make in the kitchen, and they don't see it in context of a long history. It wasn't just your Bubby who did it. So I agree that this is crucial.
Yeah, if I could add to what Shannon was just saying, is I like what Edgar Bronfman say. I would also argue similar to the larger food world, and I'm sure Jeremy can speak to this, but you want to first learn the basics and learn the foundations before you're innovating and changing. And I do think that there's this tendency or this desire or this need for novelty and newness and excitement on social media to just mix things together and make it so that, you have like this babka meets, I don't know, special sweet bun, from East Asia, which can be exciting. But, a lot of, and there's restaurants that are doing the same, and that, using malawach for sandwiches from the Yemenite tradition, mixing it with this thing from the Polish tradition. And I sometimes, until you actually perfect or learn and understand not just the historical roots, but the culinary roots of these foods and why we're making them and how we make them, we can get something far richer and far more meaningful with intention. And you can see there's some great examples of this. I like to point to the restaurant in Brooklyn called Shalom Japan, which is a chef, Aaron Israel, and his wife Suoku, and they're both she's Japanese, he's Eastern European, Jewish, Ashkenazi, and he worked actually in a deli. He's one of the first chefs at the Mayalan Deli in Brooklyn, and he trained as a chef. And they saw these similarities between their food cultures, and they actually mashed them up in really creative and inventive ways. They make a matzo ball ramen soup that is with a chicken broth. That's one of the best soups I've ever had. But it takes understanding those foundations, both historical but also culinary, to get to the place where the mashup is meaningful and thoughtful and frankly good. And so I see it's quick and easy on social media to gravitate towards the shock, but not necessarily towards the quality. Jeremy, I saw you had something to say there.
I'm giggling to myself because I made like a Mizrahi Hebrew national style salami last week, and you're talking about blending the Polish and some of those food flavors. So I just giggled to myself, and what you said is right on the head. And I kind of want to just loop back really quick to like the importance of social media. I have written a book about how we use a Japanese mold in a Jewish deli, and my co-author and research partner, we met on social media. We met via Instagram. And we ended up
put that in the chat box. Put the link to that book when you're finished.
Yeah. I definitely can do that. But we talk about how we make our rye bread and our pastrami and our matzo ball soup with a Japanese mold. So one thing I want people to understand is we're in the 21st century. We don't have our flying cars like we were promised, but we do have this completely internetworked global culture now. If I want an ingredient from Israel, if I want an ingredient from Shanghai, if I want an ingredient from Torino, Italy, I can literally go to one or maybe even two stores in my area local to me and find everything I need. So we have this blending. We've all moved all over the place. We've traveled from one place to another, and we've picked up identities along the way. And the way we can really connect with our family members, our friends who are in other areas due to the diaspora, is social media is excellent for that. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Actually, Jeffrey, since you spoke, I'd like to ask you, I read a wonderful article of yours that was published in the New York Times right before Passover several years ago. I think it was 2017. And you described how easy it was today for people to celebrate Passover and keep a completely strict diet just by going to the supermarket. You have everything you need, all the processed food that you have, and you don't have to spend hours in the kitchen the way previous generations did. So I wanted to hear your take on that.
Yeah, thank you. Russell, I can tell you that I start that article that it's an op-ed about not making Passover too easy. I started off talking about an experience I had spending Passover in Zimbabwe, of all places, where I stayed with a family, the last kosher family in Harare, about 15, 16 years ago. And they did not have access to any of those processed foods for Passover. In fact, I was coming from South Africa and they said, please bring us matzah, cured meats, bring us the Passover, kosher for Passover foods. And so I brought them a few things, but they made, it was a family that was half Lithuanian, half Litvak, and half Sephardic from the island of Rhodes. And, but I had one completely Litvak Seder, one Sephardic Seder, and they were the best seders I've ever had food-wise. Everything was so authentic. It was, these recipes that were literally handed down from generations with some updates because they had a fresh avocado tree in their backyard and plucked avocados and served them as well and mixed it in. And they were complaining about how hard it is to make Passover. And at the same time, I was eating the best food I've ever had. And I have these strange associations as an American Jew who grew up like, I have a fondness for some of those, Passover candies and, like the chocolate covered marshmallows and the jelly rings. And I have a fondness. I even as a kid liked what I now realize is cardboard Passover cereal. But I can't speak to that, Carl, about the worms. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar. But basically, I was finding that the kosher aisle just kept getting bigger and bigger, and the Passover selection to the point that you can now buy frozen kosher for Passover pizza in the Passover section. You can basically make it so that Passover just is basically a gluten-free version of our everyday lives. And what I loved most about this Jewish tradition was the constraints put on it, and I love that that's one of the things I like about Jewish food in general and kashrut is that those constraints make you be creative. And in fact, some of the homemade Jewish desserts and Jewish dishes required finding ways to seek out creaminess or crunchiness or to find flavors that otherwise wouldn't be there, to use almond flour to make cakes that is actually, it makes a very special, moist, unusual cakes that you wouldn't get otherwise. And I liked that, and I felt like something was missing. So I was just kind of putting a call out there. It is more time consuming. However, for me in my life, I like to cook with community, with family. I don't want to have to take it on myself. And I did hear from a lot of people who rightly said that having these processed foods available did make their lives easier. And I was sort of asking the question, but what are we missing? What are we losing? Because while Shannon might disagree about whether a homemade matzo ball is better than a boxed matzo ball, I would argue that like the quality difference is so much better of a homemade matzo ball when you get to add all sorts of things in, you get to curate that experience. And for me, the return on investment it's clear. But some fighting words there, I know, but I just wanted to.
They are fighting words. I want to hear, I agree with you, but I want to hear what Shannon has to say.
I'm so happy to argue with you, Jeffrey. And also, it sounds to me like you just invited me over for matzo balls. That's what I heard, right? I'm ready. I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, my local ShopRite in Livingston, New Jersey is already preparing the enormous aisle of products that will get unloaded, right, this Passover. And every year I share video of my local supermarket. It's not even a kosher market, it's just my local supermarket. And people around the country are in awe of the quantity and variety of products. I did not grow up keeping kosher in any way. I'm a child of an interfaith marriage. I like to joke I'm a pizza bagel. My mom's Sicilian, American, Italian, Brooklyn born and raised, and my dad is Ashkenazi Jewish. And the first time I had a truly kosher Passover experience, I'll never forget. It was beautiful and wonderful in so many ways. And I have never had a worse stomach ache. And it was because And I did not know what was happening to me, right? And it was because of a lot of the products, right, that are on the market and make life convenient and also are not necessarily healthier for us. So I do love cooking things from scratch. After all, as a Jewish mother, I have to fetch about something. So if I can't be a martyr about Passover cooking, I'm gonna have to find something else. But it does provide meaningful connection, time to be in the kitchen with your family, ways to bring back traditions, healthier for our bodies and for the environment too, I firmly believe in. However, I do love boxed Moz Ball mix, and I will live and die by making it that way, just adding my own schmaltz and maybe some chopped dill. But Jeffrey, invite me over and I'm happy to change my mind for you.
Shannon,
So-
anytime.
I'm coming.
Yes, so let's go to Shannon now. I'd like to have everybody watch a TikTok that she did for Hanukkah, preparing latke hors d'oeuvres with lox and sour cream her way. So let's go. That's great. So
I do want to make sure I give credit to my longtime friend and colleague, Sonia Sanford, who she and I have been writing together and collaborating for a very long time. This is her beautiful cookbook that just came out.
Oh, I saw that.
She filmed that, and it's a recipe that we had worked on together.
Yeah, it's mouth-watering just watching it. So Shannon, I wanted to ask you, I know that you have an interest in healthy cooking, that you were you had something with Hadassah. You were like the healthy food guru for them for a year, right?
Yes, I think it was ill-informed, but yes.
So I just was thinking that with your experience trying to make foods more healthy, do you find resistance by people who are used to the old way of the old taste and textures of their parents and their Bubby Zadie, that they're resistant to having more healthful versions of it?
So I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I think that there's a difference between what people say that they want and what they actually want, right? And people will say till they're blue in the face, we really want healthy versions of these. We want sugar-free versions. We want blah, 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 blah. The number of people who really actually want that is so few, maybe with a few exceptions, and I'll talk about that, because they don't actually click on that content, right? So we know what they actually want because we have the numbers that we can see behind the scenes. So I think that there isn't resistance. I think people want latkes and kugel and brisket the way that they remember having it. They want the nostalgia and they don't want to alter it. I think there are some exceptions for specific health concerns where that might not be the case. The exception to that, I do believe, is for those keeping vegetarian and vegan diets, gluten-free diets, where they do want to still be able to enjoy the classic comfort, nostalgic foods that they loved from growing up and associate with holidays and ritual. But they want to be able to do it, without meat, in a vegan diet, in a gluten-free way, things like that. And I think you're seeing so many cookbook authors, creators, and also restaurants around the country satisfying that need and desire from audiences and from people looking for that. So I myself try to do a balance, right? Like I shared, I'm rendering my own schmaltz at least some of the time, sometimes with a kid in tow. Yes, I'm sure I'll send someone to therapy for that photo. And I just believe in moderation, right? Like you're not making latkes every day of the year, but when you're making them, yeah, for real, fry them. If you like baking them, great. That's you do you. You should do it the way that you enjoy it. But I think, for these things where the taste and the smell and the experience is so important, I'm a believer in just going full force. Enjoy that babka, enjoy that full fat brisket, right? Because you're not having it all of the time, and balance it the rest of the time with other foods that nourish you health wise.
Right, just have one portion instead of three.
Well, it's also worth just noting that what is healthy has changed over time. And for a long time, there was a fear of fat. And now we're realizing how important fat is for our brain cognition, and how animal fats and non-saturated fats are, actually they're important for our diet in various different ways. And trans fats, that we've replaced a lot of them with, are actually terrible for us. So we're learning a lot. It's changing too. And so, now people who are patients with Alzheimer's, it's encouraged for them to eat more fat. So what happens when we take fat out of our diet? What constitutes health? That's been changing too. And so I'm a big fan of schmaltz, and I know that I think this entire panel is probably schmaltz friendly. And I would say there's also, to Shannon's point, what are we eating? Fatty pastrami sandwiches every day? No, eat a fatty pastrami sandwich when you eat it, and then eat salad the rest of the time. But enjoy it, but also it's not the fat that's going to get us. It's probably the nitrates maybe in this, and maybe not even that. So I think just kind of revisiting some of our late 20th century ideas of health are also necessary for this cuisine.
And also access to things like meat, right? And the frequency with which Americans are eating that is in totally different scale, right? You weren't we have access to as much meat as we can afford to buy. But that's not necessarily the way that our ancestors, our great-grandparents were eating, right? So that is totally changing the way that we're approaching food. So if we actually think back on what their version of that, you weren't eating brisket on a random Tuesday, or even Shabbat every week, right? That was so much more scaled back.
Well, going back to schmaltz, when I was a little girl, on Fridays, my mother would make griven. In English, they call it grievenis. In Yiddish, it's called griven. And I would just sit by the frying pan and I would just eat a lot of it. So this was every week. Now I have a little bit, I have high cholesterol, so I have to watch it. But it's not always once a year. And so you do have to have some sense of self-control, because, we want to stay alive. And so balancing that, I still remember that taste, the crunch, but you have to have self-restraint at the same time.
I wanted to add, speaking of the meat of the matter, I guess, that is something to circle back to, the TikTokification and more so the internet at large. That's actually what, I probably didn't eat that much Jewish food, traditional Jewish food, in my early 20s, even 30s, because my association was so meat heavy. But it's because of the internet. And a lot of these, like Shannon touched on, that there's a lot of folks who make their whole internet identity is, I do Jewish vegan food, I do Jewish vegetarian food. I think it's Little Yenta's is in Philadelphia. I think they do a lot of vegan Jewish stuff. There's the Pacific Northwest, of course, has a lot of Jewish vegan vegetarian accounts. But it was Jeffrey's book, The Gefilteria. I know it's not a vegetarian book, but that kind of opened my eyes to how much meat, or what lack of meat that was actually in our diet historically, and kind of set me down a rabbit hole to finding out all these other content creators who are exploring this world that's based on traditional Jewish eating that didn't have meat in it, but also kind of evolving it to, whether it's meat replacement for things that just are meaty dishes in Jewish food, like vegan briskets or whatever, or coming up with their own interpretation on things. So this is also a thing that I think, the TikTok, Instagram, internet world that we live in now has actually helped better connect people like me to realizing if I want to eat Jewish, I don't necessarily need to eat meat.
Yeah. Well, jumping off of that, I want to ask Jeremy, your delicatessen in Cleveland, Ohio, which for those of you who don't know, it's called Larder, a curated delicatessen and bakery, is a classic Eastern European deli that uses and promotes local and wild foods. And Jeremy, I want you to give us some examples of how you satisfy the customer's desire for the authentic tastes and textures of old world cooking, while also using local, fresh ingredients.
Yeah, I first do want to touch on like just kind of this general meat conversation too, because it extends to any ingredient that we use and then consume. And what people need to understand is just because we have a hechsher on something does not mean it's good for the ecology, the environment, or our body. You know, we have to have that conversation of what kashrut was, what it was designed to do, and what we now consider kosher. Because as many people have alluded to, just because something's coming out of a package on a store shelf and has a hechsher on it, it may be horrible for you. It may be filled with all sorts of filler and highly processed ingredients. And as far as I'm concerned, those are not kosher ingredients. Those are not holy natural things in, you know, Hashem's eyes. Those are things that we've manipulated and morphed and found a way to say that they're kosher. So I think part of that needs to be a huge part of it. And an example, kind of looping into what you said, Raquel, is how we use local ingredients. So I do not maintain a kosher delicatessen. So that's one thing. And my envision of kosher is sourcing as close to my restaurant as I can, and sourcing ingredients and animals that were treated in the best way possible. So for example, I do use certified Angus beef. I'm not sure if they have a kosher spec in their line. They might somewhere. I wouldn't be surprised, but they raise many different types of beef. And the majority of what they raise is what we would call industrial feedlot beef. These are cows that are raised, they're packed tightly in pens, they go through a chute to be slaughtered, they're poop on each other, they pee on each other, they don't have room to turn around, they can't clean their bodies. This is not a setting I would like myself to be in, let alone something I am then going to put into my body. All right. But I have a local style of this certified Angus beef that's raised, processed, slaughtered, no more from 60 miles from the front door of my restaurant. I know most of the farmers, the animals are out to pasture for most of their lives, except the last 8 to 12 weeks of their life when they are supplemented with grain feed to kind of fatten them up. My brisket's always stamped prime. So while I do get certified Angus beef, I had to search out and seek this very specific holy kosher spec that I envision, this clean spec to be able to produce. And I have other factors I have to think about too, running a restaurant, because I go through 200 pounds of this brisket a week. So, you know, some of these thoughts of how do we cook at home versus how we cook in a restaurant are very, very different for me. That being said, some of the things apply where I do not waste anything. I do not trim fat off my brisket and then not use it. I leave fat on my brisket in a way so that people can eat it. And I'm sorry if you like lean, but you are a grown-up and you can scrape off the extra fat you don't like. This is how this food comes. So, you know, there's many complexities to all of this and how we eat and why we eat and what foods we've been told are okay to eat, by what science and what time period. All right, many of us are influenced by science we absorbed when we were little children. Things change. Our understanding of the world evolves, it changes. So we need to update those things, and it can be very difficult for people. You know, my parents are in their 70s and, you know, changing healthy eating, what they think is healthy, you know, is not necessarily healthy anymore and viewed as healthful. My clear line for health and healthfulness, I cut the line at industrialized food. I don't care if it's Manischewitz gefilte fish in a jar. I don't care if it's an artisan pickled product, you know. I also don't care if it's Oreos. That's where I draw the line between what I consider wholly kosher, good for me, good for the environment, good for my local economy. That's where I draw the line. So there's many of these dynamics.
Yeah. Just for the record, we do have kosher meat that is sustainable, like Row and Behold.
And yes, and there's many organizations. Pardon me, I don't remember their proper name, but there is an organization that promotes kosher pastured animals that come off of grass, that aren't put through an industrialized slaughter system, because we developed a kosher slaughter system industrially so we could feed more people. And now we're realizing that how we treat those animals, what we put them through, is just as important as anything else about them. So we want to be kind to them just as we are to another person. We have to come to the reality. We are going to kill this animal and eat it. It will go through an unpleasurable experience. So everything that animal needs to have in life leading up to that needs to be as luxurious, pleasurable, and natural to that animal as possible. When we take animals out of those settings and put them in others, that's when I feel they become unclean.
Right. I'd like to give some time to our viewers who have some questions. If you have a question, please don't put it in the chat box, put it in the question and answer box. And keep it brief because otherwise it takes too long. So I have one question here. I can only get grievin sporadically at our deli. How do you make it? I know it's simple, but I need some tips. Who would like to answer him?
What was it that they could get?
Grievin,
Oh.
made from the schmaltz.
Move
Anybody?
to Cleveland. I can feed it to you every day.
Well, it's a question how to make it.
Yeah, how to make it.
That's easy.
Take
But that's the
fat.
thing, he knows it's easy, he or she,
Yeah.
I can't.
There's
No,
two things you can do. All right. So the easiest way, if you do have a meat grinder at home, like an attachment for your mixer or something, I recommend doing that. You get the best extraction, the crunchiest little bits, and they're great to use instead of the bacon bits, a salad topper, all that stuff, where you need some crunch and some fat. But it is as simple as put a cast iron pan on your stovetop, turn the heat to low, put all the chicken skins in there, maybe a little bit of water if you want, and kind of let it go. An hour, I don't know, 30 minutes, it'll be done when it's done, when it smells good, when the gribbiness is brown, but not too brown, and when there's a lot of fat there. And that's it. You pour the fat off, you take the gribbiness out, and you put a little salt on them. Go to town.
If I could offer
If it's
just
kosher chicken, you may not have to salt it because kosher chicken is salted already.
it can
Yes.
always use more salt. It's great with salt. I would just say like a good practice is this is what I do. I just have a quart container in my freezer, and every time I am preparing chicken, any fat, if I'm gonna trimming off any skin, whatever, I keep it all and I wait for this quart container to fill up, and then I just render the schmaltz. I make ribbonous. And to Jeremy's point, I love putting the gribbiness in other dishes as well, or just as toppings. So almost like little umami dust. And in fact, it was quite trendy in New York restaurants and other restaurants around the country for a few years. I think there was an article in Bon Appetit about the trendiness of gribbiness in professional kitchens. It's a great. And then in terms of the onions, I'm just seeing Pamela's question there. Often chicken schmaltz is often flavored with onions, and you can just throw onions in as well, and it gives it a bit more of that flavor. I'd like to make schmaltz with duck and goose fat. I would not want to, chicken schmaltz is it's sort of like extra virgin olive oil, virgin olive oil, like light olive oil. It's goose and duck, and then it's chicken. So chicken can be enhanced with onions, but don't mess with your duck or goose schmaltz. Like that is just great on its own.
So I wanted to ask you when you
Can
said
I
you
can I
put it in a
bring
jar.
up can I bring up one thing, in relation to what Jeffrey said and some of what Shannon's been saying? You save up this quart, or 2 quarts in your freezer, then you make schmaltz once and you have gribbiness. And if you don't eat it all at once, it's okay. It freezes beautifully. It stores in the refrigerator for a long time because there's no moisture in it. It's just fat. It doesn't go bad like other foods do. So you make this once and you have it that you can use in moderation for a long period of time. So that's it. This perceived notion that we need the convenience. Well, you're creating it as you're cooking, as you're stockpiling your ingredients, as you're saving things, and then you make something once and you can use it for a long period of time. That is just as convenient as buying a jar off a shelf and opening it, in my
So I
eyes.
wanted to ask you, if you have that jar in the freezer, how do you thaw it when you take it out, and how long does it take to thaw?
You don't even need a thaw. You can just throw it right into the pan. It's the beauty of it. It should be so easy. And I should note, right around Hanukkah time is when in the shtetls, you'd fatten up your geese after the high holidays. You'd slaughter them right around Hanukkah. You'd have a Hanukkah goose. You'd render all that fat, and you'd have that fat through the winter, and you'd even put some aside and lock it some people locked in little vessels and saved for Pesach, and even stored the liver of the goose waiting for Pesach. So, this was a practice that was done in the shtetl, and it has such application to our lives today as well.
Now, speaking of Hanukkah, Shalom Aleichem stories tell me that the Jews did not necessarily eat the latkes with sour cream, as I thought. Many of them made it with schmaltz. They fried it in schmaltz, and it was, heavenly. So obviously you couldn't mix meat with milk. So you had to choose. Am I going to make it in schmaltz, or going to make it in, I guess they used oil? What did they use?
It depends on what group of Jews at what period of time and what latke they were making. We have a lot of evidence. Gil Marx did great research. Lockas came out of the end of the Inquisition. Jews fled to Sicily. There was evidence that the earliest latkes that we kind of have a written report of were very similar to what you'd find on a brunch menu as a lemon ricotta pancake now. And they were made in Italy, so they were using olive oil if they were Jewish, because otherwise you'd be using pork fat. And the renderings from there, typically at that time period, that was the small animal that could live on those islands, and they'd use a lot of the fat of. They did some poultry, but the latkes are a different thing, and we've used different things to make them throughout time. So it's more the question of what latke is it, and from when, and which one do you identify the most with?
Right. So Barbara Silverstein asks, how do people feel about lab-grown meat and dairy? I'm assuming that she's thinking of the taste. Animals do remain unharmed, but is it food? Who would like to answer to that one?
I mean, I could say a couple of small things as probably the resident vegetarian. So for me, if it solves the problems that it's trying to solve, that's great. I'm very skeptical of it, and for me, I get excited when I went vegetarian. I got excited more about like vegetables, fruits, grains, rice, like these things, and lentils, chickpeas, all of these things. I wasn't looking to replace it with fake meat, and what little I've had hasn't been very good. It's rubbery. So, if they're able to figure out how to solve the problems, if that's going to solve the problems, that's great. But anecdotally, if I remember correctly, they've really been struggling to get meat eaters to eat these things, because the idea was that, if you want to do so-called the ethical thing and stop eating meat, or stop eating so much meat, you'll go to these meat replacements, but it's not as good as the real thing, so they're not going to switch. And then vegetarians don't necessarily miss the meat, so they're not going to buy it either. And so my understanding is it hasn't really kicked off as much as they had hoped, but if it works, then I'm happy it gets there.
I'm not a vegetarian all the time, but I do try to keep I think maybe it's Mark Bittman, I forget the term that he uses, but basically during
Yeah, like 4-6.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Exactly. My husband is like, he would eat meat all the time, every meal, every single night for dinner. Drives me nuts. And it's been a very nice compromise for us to try some of the meat replacements. I agree, Joe, it's not as good. I think maybe in the US it might be a little bit different in Europe in terms of like the quantity of products. But I see Judy commenting Beyond Burgers. We buy the Beyond Burgers, the other kinds of ground meat, and it's not as good, I would say, as like using legumes and tofu and chickpeas as a protein replacer. Agree, but I think for some of the meat eaters who otherwise wouldn't even consider going vegetarian, it's a nice alternative that's environmentally friendly and gives them a little bit of that satisfaction. And I think there's a lot of kosher and Jewish applications for those products as well, right? Whether it's like a way to get a cheeseburger fix, or a way to make a vegetarian style of like, meat stuffed onions or other stuffed vegetables, right? And give it a little bit of that. So, but it does have a weird aftertaste sometimes, for sure.
I'm here for all of them. All of them. Everything from the meat alternatives like Joe and Shannon have just touched on, and like the culturing of muscle cells in petri dishes and actually growing muscles, growing flesh without having an animal that we have to kill. I'm here for all of it. There's a few things we have to understand though, okay? They're incredibly exciting. They're incredibly filling, but we're using them in the wrong ways. First off, we don't have to replace meat. We have to use less meat. Well, that's one thing we all have to understand. You got our physiology. We do not need as much animal-based protein as any of us consume. Okay, especially here in America. So we do not need to replace any meats. All right. We have to understand that each of these foods is unique in their own right and has a place in various diets and dietary restrictions. So there's going to be a role that each of these foods can play for many people across many socioeconomic classes who will be able to have access to various ones at different times for different reasons. So they are going to be very important going forward. But we have to understand we do not need to replace meat. We have to eat less meat. And we have to also understand the application, the technologies used to establish these things have applications in other industries, which could benefit from the use of them. So just because something is developed for a diet or something culinarian doesn't mean that the applications can't help us in off-world exploration, deep sea exploration, medical science and technology, general understanding of biology, chemistry, and physics, both popularized and in academic settings. So these are kind of like really big, complex things that we have to dissect. We have whole groups of people that we have to re-educate and further educate as to how fast these technologies are moving, what they will realistically be able to do for us, what groups of people they will best benefit, because they're not going to benefit all people equally all the same way. So we have to have realistic discussions as to who should be eating what and for what reasons and what best suits them too. Because there's so many people that don't have a choice in what they actually get to eat because of where they live and how much money they make and potentially the color of their skin, or like us, what we believe. So there are all these complexities that we have to understand. And that's why I say I'm here for all of it. We just have to understand, as Shannon and Joe has said, they're not as good, but we're looking at them in comparison to something. We're not looking at them as their own ingredient. We have to come up with new terminology. We can't call them chicken or, fish with a PH. Like, we have to come up with whole new words, terminologies, ways to convey what these foods are without calling them what they're inspired by. And once we do that, which is a massive hurdle that brilliant minds across the world are going to have to work on, because we are a globalist society and all these things interfeed across social media and various platforms. So this is going to take a lot of work. But once those things happen, hopefully we'll have good, healthy populations that won't damage the environment, cause climate change, put beef before their personal needs or those sorts of things. And we'll be able to all kind of coexist with the natural world and embrace tikkun olam.
Sounds
it.
good.
I'm curious if what
There was
kind
a
of
lot there. I'm sorry.
I can't even touch that. I'm curious, at Larder, what kinds of dishes do you feature that are meat free, or do you feature any of these products on your menu?
Yeah, and Joe can attest to it. He's
I was
coming
going to
in.
say, the last time I was there, I had this delicious, I don't know if you called it like a pastrami tape, but you had this portobello mushroom sandwich that was just phenomenal.
Oh,
And
yeah. And they weren't portobellos. We don't ever use portobellos. They were a different mushroom. But
Okay.
yeah, that would have been Latiparus sulphureus, which is a wild harvest mushroom that we get. And we put that mushroom through the exact same process that we put our beef brisket through to make a pastrami. And we end up we can call that a vegan pastrami. Pastrami is the technique, not the ingredient. It started off as poultry and pastrami in Turkey, poultry in Romania, came to the US. They use navel and flank. Now we use brisket, all these things. So it's the technique behind the production of all those foods that give us pastrami, and the spice coating, not necessarily what the ingredient is. And we focus on that kind of thought process every day on our menu. I'd say on any given day, 65% of our menu is vegetarian and vegan. We make all our own pickles. I have a dozen pickles in the case today. They're all fermented, made from local produce for the most part. And we have all those. I have a kimchi that has fish sauce in it, so we let people know. Any given day, we have both vegan and vegetarian entree, either sandwich or platter choices. So we embrace a ton of that. I make charcuterie out of vegetables. So
I was going to say, Jeremy, you sent me in the mail some carrot, beet, and I think maybe like zucchini charcuterie.
Yeah. And those were on the early edge of, we've refined the processes considerable since then. So we take whole vegetables, and instead of making a Jewish salami out of beef, I can make it out of mushrooms and mold and various starches, and I can hold them together, and I can offer, awesome, awesome vegan food. And we can do that with whole vegetables, and we can do that with blends of stuff. So we have a ton of options. I kind of want to bring up your Locka video. When we designed our Locka recipe, we only use potato in it. And the reason for this is so that I can serve chocolate ice cream on it, but I can also give it to a vegan, or I can put pastrami on it, and everybody can eat it and is happy. We cook the potatoes in a very specific way that's the only ingredient we need, so it works. But there's many, many different things you can do to create inclusive food for everybody.
So
Yeah.
one thing I just want to add on to the meat conversation we're having that led up to this is, and back to the constraints. And one of my issues with this new meat technology is that it's not. We have a lot of creative solutions to this issue, right? Like there were meat shortages throughout Eastern Europe, throughout Europe for a long time, which is why all these immigrant Jews came to America and said, we can eat meat 3 days a week. It's so cheap here. But Jeremy, you're wearing a mushroom sweatshirt right now. Like, there's so much wisdom that was lost among those immigrant Jews who came to this country. They knew how to forage. My grandfather survived for 9 months during the war in the forest, and he knew how to eat, and he, knew what to pick. And there was that wisdom that we've lost. And my problem with some of the new meat creations is that it's a capitalist solution. It's a consumerist driven solution. It's purchasing our way out of it when every culture has already it's naturally plant forward dishes that mix legumes and grains and create complete proteins. My grandmother was a vegetarian. Fania Lawando in Vilna had a vegetarian restaurant. That vegetarian movement was created because of those meat shortages. And so again, those constraints led to not just searching for nutrition, but also flavor in really interesting and creative ways. And Jeremy, I think you also embody that in using these molds. And, it's not too dissimilar to the world of vegetable lactofermentation and the pickling and preserving that took place in the shtetls for so long. It helped us make it through the winters, but also provided essential nutrients. And, we lose that. And of course, we're in the 21st century. We have supermarkets. We don't all have root cellars where we can keep barrels of sauerkraut, or even in the tenements, people used to keep barrels of sauerkraut in those tenements, and people would knock on the door and shred your cabbage for a nickel. Like that doesn't exist anymore. However, this millions and millions and millions of dollars in investment into these solutions, listen, I ultimately think it's a net positive, but I just worry that we're not doing the work to relearn some of that wisdom that was likely lost because of displacement. And I think that there are incredible things we can look to the past to inform our future that don't require such technology as well.
In fact, I just want to put something in. I have friends from the former Soviet Union who are so good at foraging for mushrooms. I mean, I went on a trip with them to the woods, and I was scared to taste any of them, but they knew what they were doing. They had learned it from their parents. I just want to finish up because we're coming towards the end of the hour. Chava Weissler asks, is it possible to obtain kosher goose that's humanely raised outside of New York? Does anybody know that question? The answer?
Yes, it is. It is. So I don't know how her company looks coming out of the pandemic, but there's a local woman here in Cleveland. Her name is Lindsay Mayerfield. There was a great article in one of the edible publications here locally about what she was doing, but she has teamed up with our local Amish farmers, who are all within an hour drive of the Cleveland area. And she is raising pasture-raised poultry and some other animals with Amish farmers. They're getting everything's being kosher slaughtered and everything. So I believe it was Mayerfield Meats. And I believe for a while she was shipping almost anywhere. So Mayer Field, Field.
Why don't you put it into the chat box so maybe some other people to do it too.
And I'll just say about goose. So I actually had done a deep dive into the world of goose and kosher goose. I wrote an op-ed about Hanukkah goose and its history. And first off, the reason it's very hard to get kosher goose is that geese need to be raised by pasture. They cannot be raised in confined lots. They can't eat corn and grain, so they require grass. and all of the industrial machinery that was built for kosher slaughter, well, for all slaughterhouses, was designed for chicken, because chickens could be raised industrially much more easily. So that's the reason it's really hard to find goose. So all the goose production is happening on a smaller local scale. And it's very hard to find kosher goose. I went on a search after I wrote this article. I heard from many goose farmers asking me to connect them to kosher slaughterhouses, because a lot of these slaughterhouses, these are USDA facilities. They will not take geese because they don't have the machinery and the equipment to handle it. Everything needs to be hand processed. So if you are going to find it, it's a real commitment. It's quite expensive. It's really a shame, because if you go to Europe, you find you still have goose production. You can get goose fat quite easily. I struggle with that. I spent a lot of money to get some kosher geese to be able to test recipes and to be able to serve. It's a shame, because goose was the preferred poultry of the shtetl Jews, because of its flavor, because of its incredible amounts of fat, and frankly, it's a more sustainable bird as well than our our modern chicken practices. So if anyone wants to find out more, I'm happy to. I think they shared the link to the op-ed, the Bring Back the Hanukkah Goose op-ed in the chat as well.
Is it easier to find kosher duck than to find kosher goose?
Yeah.
Okay. This has been so wonderful, having.
If anybody ever wants to meet a farmer, listen, I contract with farmers in my area too that raise animals for me. If anybody's in the Cleveland area, we can raise a goose, we can find a showhead, we can find someone to help us with the kosher slaughter, and we can go down to the farm and do it. So that's another thing.
Yeah, put that into the chat box, how they can connect.
Yeah, if people are going to eat meat, you have to understand it is messy to turn an animal into meat, and you need to understand what that animal goes through, how it feels. You have to connect with this. It's not all boneless, skinless chicken breasts out there. So I encourage anybody that wants to join me. I don't mean to be talking so joyful about slaughter, but anybody who would like to be able to experience that and connect with that, please just reach out.
I'm
Okay,
booking my trip, Jeremy.
So I just want to say how much I've enjoyed talking to these food mavens, these kosher and non-kosher food mavens. And I hope our audience has enjoyed it as well. This is going to be on a YouTube. So if you want your friends who weren't able to be here, come and see it. We'll have it on YouTube. So as we say in Yiddish, sei gesinnt. I'm wishing you all a happy Purim and a
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Thank you.
Thank you.